who I will first, your lead faculty for today's session, my colleagues Junious Williams, who's a senior advisor at the Collective Impact Forum, and Nanette Antwi-Donkor, who is a senior program manager at the Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions. Additionally, we have our colleague Tracy Timmons Gray, who serves as our Associate Director of Community and Programs at the Collective Impact Forum, and she will be available to support you with any of your tech needs for today. So we would love to hear from you all today. So as you can see, you have both a Q&A box and a chat box. So we do encourage you to place all of your questions for our faculty today. We encourage you to put those in the Q&A box, and then you can have general conversation, engage with each other, share resources, etc. in that chat box. So again, the Q&A box for your questions and the chat box for any other engagement. There is a recording of today's discussion, and that will be available to you all after this session later in the week or early next week. So you will receive an email with that in addition to the presentation deck for today. And that can also be downloaded from the link that's been shared in the chat. Your live captions are automatically on, so if you do wish to turn those off, you can go to live transcript in your webinar menu and choose hide subtitle. And then again, if you have any technical difficulties or need any support, you can reach out to Tracy directly in the chat, or you can email her at tracy.timmons-gray@collectiveimpactforum.org. So before we continue our time today, we want to begin by acknowledging the indigenous lands that we are all joining from. Now, although we are gathering virtually, we still believe that it is important to acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from indigenous territory. And we honor and respect the diverse indigenous peoples connected to this land and honor their past, present, and future. So I would like to note that today's session is being both recorded and presented on the traditional land of the Piscataway, Muskogee, Ohlone, Coast Salish, Muckleshoot, Stillaquamish, Suquamish, and Duwamish people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and these tribes. And we invite you now to participate in this land acknowledgement. So if you are in the US or in Canada, you can use the link that's being placed into the chat to identify which indigenous land you are currently occupying. And if you are outside of the US and Canada, we still invite you and would love to see which indigenous territories you are calling in from. Thank you all so much for starting to send those. So if this is your first time doing this, or if this is new information for you, we invite you to make note of what you just learned about the indigenous lands you are on. This is a great first step to understand more about the indigenous communities that are a part of your area, both historically and currently. We also want to recognize that acknowledging indigenous lands and communities is just the first step in strengthening knowledge, relationships, and accountability to better support our indigenous community members. Relationship building and understanding community context are key factors for successful collaboratives. As you build your own deep knowledge of the many layers within the community or communities that your collective impact effort supports, taking action to learn, build connections, and strengthen relationships with their indigenous community members, including Native-led organizations and governance bodies, can be very helpful. Now, when thinking about what next steps to take, the Native Governance Center, a Native-led nonprofit organization that supports leadership development and tribal governance support programs, has wonderful resources on taking next steps beyond land acknowledgement and strengthening relationships within your community. We will include the link to the work in the chat, and you can also find them at nativegov.org. So we're going to provide a little framing for today's conversation. So again, as you heard the song when you entered, this is about data and supporting a culture of data and learning. So we want to frame our time together, and then we'll start with the 3 questions that were submitted in advance of today's office hour. and then again, invite you all to start putting questions into the Q&A box. So I'm going to invite Junious to speak to this particular slide.
Thank you, Courtney. And for me, it's still morning. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. This graphic is one of my two favorite graphic images in terms of thinking about collective impact. The other one some of you have seen is actually a video on herding cats, and maybe Tracy could put a link to that one in. A great sort of image of what's happening in these collective impact processes. But this is the second one for me. And just really briefly, if you start on the left-hand side, everyone trying to do collective impact or any sort of collaborative work comes into it with a history of what's happened in their communities, in their organization, and this notion of the inability to achieve the success that we want in terms of outcomes creates this urgency. An urgency to act, to behave differently, an urgency around getting the resources that are needed, figuring out who the champions are, but a whole process that goes in to readying the community to say, we're going to deal with things differently, and we're going to form a collaborative structure to really carry us to the work. And as you see, there's common agendas. The first thing that the group has to do is pulling together and figuring out not what each one of us want to do or accomplish in terms of our individual organizational imperatives, but what we want to do on a common agenda. And as you see, it's sort of corralling the group, getting the right people into the table and figuring out what the nature of that work is that we want to do together. And it's working groups, and it's forming the backbone to make sure that the work is supported as everybody launches onto this long journey. And it's a journey for me. The aspiration, the journey, the destination are all really about learning and continuous improvement, right? Because for me, that's the engine that's going to get us to achieve outcomes across population that we've never been able to before. And there are elements like shared measurement, absolutely important, and mutually reinforcing. All the components or conditions of collective impact are essential, but the fertile ground that we're planning and sort of wallowing in is this learning and continuous improvement. And that's why I like this, because figuring out it's not a straight linear path there. You're going to take some detours. You're trying to figure out what hasn't been figured out in your community before as you ascend this mountain of really trying to transform these systems that are holding inequities and are holding a lack of progress and health and prosperity for the communities. So I love this as a graphic to say, the real work of this is in that valley where we're trying to learn, figure out what we can do better and doing it better. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Courtney.
Thank you, Junious. And then quickly, we'll just frame sort of how we think about continuous learning and collective impact. And one of the things that Junious mentioned, right, is like, this is a journey and a destination. And you think about yourself driving somewhere, right? You don't want to wait until the end to figure out if you're going in the right direction, right? Or if you're making the right turns or things like that. And so that's how you can think about continuous learning and continuous improvement as what are the indicators and what are the things or ways in which we know that we're moving in the right direction on our work, there's a possibility that we'll see some demonstrable, right, like changes and shifts in the issues and outcomes that we're focused on. And so what you have in front of you, again, we look at this as sort of the three core elements of continuous learning and collective impact. And so the first, is about learning priorities, right? And those are co-created and agreed upon by the group, right? So what are the things we're setting out to learn? What are our learning questions for the year, right? And you can think about this both in the context of how your collaborative is operating right. So like from a network perspective, but also again from those outcomes perspective, right? So thinking about things like how are people learning together? How is knowledge shared? How is knowledge managed in this space, right? Do we see a difference in when we're doing those things, right? Do we see differences then in how people are doing their work and approaching their work? And then are we seeing those differences show up in those outcomes? So what are those core priorities and core questions that we want to focus on for the year, for the quarter, et cetera? And then the next piece, right, is around the learning plan. So what are the ways in which and what are the activities that we're going to use to be engaged in learning, right? So I always tell people, one, you find those spaces that already exist. If we're already meeting monthly, right, what are the opportunities for us to build learning into those spaces? Are there ways for us to be reflective about our data, right, and think about how does it then impact the work that we're doing outside of this space when we leave from this 2 or 3 hour meeting? And what are the ways in which we want to engage in learning? Is it people sharing? Is it data walks, right? Those types of activities that lend themselves to the learning piece. And then the learning culture, right? Like what type of precedents are we setting around learning, right? Do we have elements in place? Do people trust each other enough to share data and share the good and the bad of the work that they're doing, right? Are we taking risk around the work that we're doing? Or are we doing really safe work, right? Where we're not able to learn and grow? So again, we think about these 3 elements as sort of the key pieces around setting a learning culture. And this is akin, as you can see on the screen, to a lighthouse, right? Those learning priorities are what shines a light, right, on the things that we should be paying attention to. The learning plan becomes sort of like that piece that allows us to hold up the work. And then the culture is the foundation, right, that helps everything else stand up, right? Like, is our culture really tight? So we want to offer those 2 sets of frames. Again, this is a journey. You're going to have bumps and bruises along the way. You might get a flat tire along the way, those types of things, right? So we think if you're liking that to driving, but like what are the opportunities for us to learn, to improve, to get better sets of tires, right? To move us along on our journey. And so with that, we are now going to shift into questions, and that's how we'll use the remainder of this time. So what that will look like, we have a few questions that we'll start with that were pre-submitted. And then again, we encourage you all. I see that there are a couple of questions, now a few, somebody just added one, a few questions in the Q&A box that we'll also do our best to get to. I do want to name that I know a lot of people submitted questions in advance, and we're probably going to get a lot of questions in real time. We unfortunately won't have the time to get through all of those, but hope that you are still able to get value out of today's time. So with that, I'm going to actually turn off the screen share because I want to see everybody's lovely faces. And we're going to jump into questions. So Junious and Nanette, the first question that we have is, how do organizations that are collaborating develop a shared approach to a learning culture? Whoever would like to start.
I can kick it off. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, wherever you might be. It's a pleasure to be with you today to share some of my experiences with you and also to, learn from you too as well. So I think that, as organizations come together to form collective impact, I think it's just like any relationship. As you come together, each person is coming with their own individual identities and their own cultures too as well. And when you become a couple, you come up with your own traditions. And so as organizations coming together to collaborate, your approach is taking the time to learn what each other's learning cultures currently are. I think it's really important to start from there. Learn what each other's cultures are, find common grounds, find common goals, find common values that brings the organizations together. And then from that, create that shared vision for your learning culture. Because like I said, like a couple, you're coming together, you're forming your own tradition. So, and that's what culture is all about. So coming together and then sharing, developing that shared vision is really critical. A shared vision that everyone is buying into and everybody's contributing to is really important. Defining what that learning culture is and what does it look like? How do we operationalize it as a collective, but also how is each organization within that group also going to operationalize it within each of their organizations is really key. And I said earlier too, communication and transparency is really important, and ensuring that you are affording the opportunities, cross-cutting opportunities to everyone in the collective, the opportunity to learn and grow, and creating that safe space is really important. And finding a system, because oftentimes we talk about this big approach, but we don't also talk about the infrastructure that supports it. Identifying the appropriate infrastructure that will support this learning culture. And then the infrastructure, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. If it's technology, it's a technologically platform, great. But it's all about identifying a system that works for everyone within that collaborative. And I invite Juniors to join in the conversation too.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree wholeheartedly with everything that you laid out. And I want to go back and reinforce one point that you made that I think is critical, which is infrastructure, right? If you're really going to sustainably encourage people and build a different sort of culture and practice around continuous learning and improvement, you need an infrastructure to do that. And on so many of these issues, what happens is people have the inspiration and know they need to do something, but they jump into it without thinking about the infrastructure that's supporting their current practices, whatever those are, and how do you build the new infrastructure? I would extend the point, it's not only infrastructure, but one of the things that I see quite frequently is routinized practices, right? If you're going to be a learning community, and if you're going to value these principles and this way of operating, it should be reflected in the way that you're structured and practices. And one of the things about learning, and Courtney alluded to this, is what are the routines that you've embedded into the way that you do the work and that people come together that are highlighting this culture of continuous learning and improvement. I would make one other general point, and I think sometimes that people who are backbones or conveners of collective impact don't set the right expectation. Everybody's coming from a different organization and coming into a common place. It's an absolutely perfect setting for saying, ain't nobody's pre-existing culture going to dominate this new table. What we're going to do is we're going to move from inclusion of getting everybody here to belonging, which means we're going to sit down and figure out how we all work together and establish a culture and sets of practices that are supportive of having a belonging environment where we're really trying to work together and use everybody's assets to benefit us collectively. And I think too many times we come in and we don't throw it open to say, we need to have this discussion about how we're going to operate and what's going to be the culture that drives our work. We jump into our corporate or or whatever the existing thing is, which by definition is going to exclude everybody who hasn't been a part of those cultural practices. Absolutely essential to stop and say, we got inclusion, now we're going to work on belonging, which is let's talk about culture and routines and practices and all the relationship building, all of the things that Nanette started laying out. That needs to be part of the way the table gets formed and not an afterthought. One of my old mentors and colleagues, Garland Yates, used to say, the way you start a table when you're trying to do collaborative work is the way that table is going to be forever. It's almost impossible to change that table, composition, culture, patterns, practices, once you let it, once you get started. So it's just saying, step back, think about this, and do some design work. Be very conscious and intentional about this because you are creating a new structure, a new beast.
Absolutely. And the only thing I would add to what Junious has offered is also having folks who can sort of be like the culture police, if you will, right? Who really hold that culture. And one of the practices, so I formerly worked in a backbone for 7 years, and one of the structures we had in place, and I wish they still had it, but we actually had all of the data leads from the participating organizations. They had their own space, like monthly space, where they were looking at data, doing learning, sharing practices, and bringing those things back into the larger network space or those collaborative spaces. But they were sort of the ones who we were able to lean on to like build those practices and routines. And two, they took those back to their individual organizations, but it was also able to be held in that space, right? Because they were the people who were like, everybody had input, right, on what it looked like, but they were the holders of that, of making sure that we were, interrogating our data, or they were interrogating their data and learning from the data as well. So having folks who can own that is really important too. Thank you both for those responses. Okay, our next pre-submitted question is, how do you help practitioners value data as a tool rather than largely seeing it as cumbersome reporting or compliance?
I'll start. I think people value something when it is something they can relate to or resonates with them. So taking the time to really understand what those practitioners, what their work is and how they do their work and how data can support the work that they're doing, I think is really important. One thing I always like to tell people is, you want to make sure you're reducing burden on the staff that are collecting the data, but also reducing the burden from the people you're collecting data from. And so it's really important to sort of understand the journey, if you will, or the process map of how folks come into your organization or into your collaborative, and figure out how you can integrate data collection into different aspects of that, so that they can see the benefit of it. Once they're able to see how the practitioners are able to see how data helps improve what they currently do, they are more willing to buy into it. And also providing training is also very critical too as well, and making it accessible. Not that the practitioners, some level of folks in your organization or in your collaborative, they collect the data and they submit it and they never see that data. They never see how that data is used. They never see how that data informs strategy. There's that disconnect. You have to be able to, again, provide that sort of feedback loop where people, when they're entering data or collecting data, they can see it. They can also, even before they get to collecting data, they can contribute to what you are collecting, and help define what to collect and how to use what to collect is really important. And taking the time to revisit what you're collecting. Does it still make sense to collect this? Or do we need to make changes as we are collecting? But I think the key is to really find ways where you are integrating data into the existing work versus, oh, we collect data at this point. But I think another key point I want to make is demystifying what data is. I think a lot of times we think data is, oh, only when we collect surveys, but that is not true. A lot of times our conversations, that's information, that's data that we are gleaning every day when we come into contact with the communities that we are serving. That is data. So being able to demystify data so they recognize that they are already doing it. They're already capturing data. So how do we enhance that and put a frame around what they're collecting and enhance that how they use it? So that's what I would encourage folks to do.
And I start out on this issue, kind of recalling part of the framing, which is too much of the data is about compliance. That's absolutely true, right? And that's a fundamental problem. And the problem is that the data have largely been about compliance, and it's largely been about measurement of big outcomes with the notion of got you. And that's the fundamental cultural problem. Data has been, and especially for smaller nonprofits, this game about gotcha, right? We look at your data and we got you. And part of what needs to be a cultural shift is we need to move it from data being about I got you to data being about I got your back, right? That data really should be a supportive thing. The problem is that these data are about compliance. And again, for smaller nonprofits and many who are especially in the service delivery mode, who have had RBA and all of these things visited upon them to say that they're not meeting their benchmarks and stuff. So the second point I would make is benefit. What's in it for me? I've seen far too many collective impact initiatives, and I like data myself, and I'm sometimes sort of a data wonk in it. But boy, we all kind of rush to these 21st, 22nd century data systems with live real-time data on it where everybody's data is coming in, and you go to sell that to a community where I can't get enough money to get somebody to really manage my spreadsheets. We created this vast divide of this vision around this integrated data system, which I love and would like to see happen. But that ain't where most of the people, and especially most of the people who are in direct contact with the folks we want to improve, that ain't where they're at. It's been used as a bludgeon. The question is, what's the benefit for me and my organization of investing in this data? Because the way it's been used in the past has been to bludgeon me. It's just like having a pet. If you beat him with that stick, you can't go with that stick later and try to attract them. They've associated in their minds with you bludgeoning them, and we've done that. The other issue, two quick other points I would make. One is data is about compliance, and it's been about compliance, so we're robbing ourselves often from performance measures around our strategies and our interventions to know how they're working. And even moreover, we've robbed ourselves of any asset data. Compliance is about messing up, right? So we got nothing on the asset side of the ledger. Again, what would be my interest if you ain't measuring what my community thinks is important for us to progress on? I'm going to step back and make one other thing. We start the data conversation at the wrong point. Nanette mentioned demystifying data. Good starting point. And the first point of demystification is data ain't objective. Data is the result of everything that I am and I have experienced when I make the decisions as a researcher about what my research questions are, my data collection, my analytic methods, the way that I interpret the whole thing. So it's really important to start this conversation of demystification around backing up. There are different types of data and information that people rely on in their lives. It's not all quantitative stuff. There are cultural things. There's a whole range of knowledge and information that we use to make decisions in everyday lives and collectively as people that need to be brought to bear. So starting this process is stepping back and having an honest conversation with people about data, demystifying data, talking about data, increasing people's sense that I got the capacity to work in this data field. I ain't going to be running multiple regression analysis, but I can sit down and say what research questions are important to me and my community. I can ask questions that inform the analysis, and certainly I can bring to bear context in the interpretation process, which is the most important thing. I can have the best data in the world, but if I don't have the experience to understand what was going on behind that data. So a lot here. And for me, it's let's make the data beneficial. People who run nonprofits or in our collaborators are not stupid, but they're looking for benefit and added value. And a lot of times the way that we approach the data stuff, nothing in it for me. You ain't building my capacity. You ain't letting me play with the data. You ain't, all of the things that cause people to think that I'm a part of this and that I can contribute, we're not doing with data. And we need to, because we're going to miss the most critical insights, right? that no matter how much book knowledge or academic understanding I have, I've not been on the other side of these processes, and there's some stuff that I just don't know. And if I don't have the right people at the table, I'm going to miss that.
Thank you both. And quickly before we move to the next question, someone had a question about clarifying what we mean by compliance. So I will set that, and then please feel free to jump in. But essentially, how I interpret the question is people gathering and using data for the sake of reporting on a grant, right? Or there might be specific things. I think back to my work with the schools. I worked with 15 schools, middle and high schools, and they were required to report and collect certain data. Now, they looked at that as like, we are by state, right, by state law and by federal law required to collect these certain data points, but they never thought about their data as like, we also have an opportunity to learn from this. We've been collecting these things because it's required by a grant, by the state, whatever that looks like, right, by our employer, excuse me, for us to do that. So that's what we would mean by compliance or reporting purposes, is that you're exclusively and specifically collecting that data for the sake of reporting on a grant or for getting a grant, right? Like a lot of times people are using data to create the narrative they need to create to get the money that they need to do their work, right? But really seeing it as an opportunity to learn from the data as well. And that was one of the things I offered to my schools. Well, if you're already required to collect these things anyway, you might as well make them work to your benefit. So how can we do that? So that's, Chris, I hope that clarifies for you what we mean by that. All right. The next question, and Nanette, you sort of alluded to this when you talked about sort of capacity building and training. But the question is, how can we best work with groups of people who greatly differ in their experience using data? What are effective approaches to improving data literacy?
So I think that when you're working with groups of people with different levels of knowledge, I think it's important, regardless of what their knowledge is, whether they're an expert or not an expert, I think it's important to establish a common language, a common ground. Make sure that the basics, everybody understands the same language that we are speaking. We all have the same foundation because we've all learned different things from our own experiences in different ways, you know? And so I think it's really important to start and make sure that there is that common language across the group. I think it's also important to understand where people are coming from and what those levels actually look like and mean, so that you can design trainings or programs that really address people where they're at, but also to move them along, because it's really like Junious said earlier, this is the journey, you know, you're continuously learning. And so it's important to think about it that way. And I'll say another key thing is, you know, building people's capacity, you have to be intentional and you have to be committed to it. So you providing the TA capacity building or whatever the case might be, there has to be intention on your part, and there has to be intention on their parts too as well, and commitment to this. And allowing them the opportunity to actually apply what they are learning to what they're doing, and ensuring that what they're learning applies to the overall mission and values of the collective or of the organization. It's really important that they have those skills. It's also important to recognize that everybody's not going to be a data expert. But the most important thing is everyone needs to be data literate. And data literate just means they have to be able to engage with data in a meaningful way that helps them do what they are doing, helps their role to be more effective. And so I think approaches of improving data literacy, you have to have a very structured approach. It has to be structured, but you also have to be flexible and nimble, because times are evolving, but then also really identifying strategies that speak to where people are at. And it's also important to consider the readiness piece. Something we don't often talk about is readiness. Are people ready now to engage, or are they ready for a particular approach? We talked about big data systems out there, and those are great. But you have to understand that introducing a new data system is an enterprise level change. And are people ready? Is the organization ready for that enterprise level change? Are you able to sustain that? These are questions you need to ask yourself. Is that tool going to be beneficial to you now? Perhaps it might not be beneficial now, but for the future. But what you can do, there's nothing wrong with a basic Excel document as long as it gets you what you need.
So for me, where I start is a couple points on this. One is with the principle, which probably we should try to extend to all of the work that we're doing, is that there's got to be multiple ways for people to engage in different parts. So if you're doing the strategy or if you're doing data, no matter what the work is, you've got to have multiple ways for people to engage in that. So not everybody, and this was the point that Nanette was just making, there are users of the data, there are kind of producers of the data, there are governors of the data. What are the opportunities for people to engage with the data and work on data and learning in any of those contexts? So that's the first thing that we've got to do is, so because of the wide variety of capacity and stuff, have a lot of different ways in which people can engage with the data. So Courtney was talking about, it may be just a data walk for some residents. I just want to have a good sense of it, but I don't want to get all deep into it. So that's one. The second thing is, for me, the most powerful tool around changing the community culture around data are community participatory research projects, right? They are powerful tools because what you do is you start engaging residents and young people and grassroots folks around the data. They're learning about the data, and it has these marvelous effects. I'm looking over at Nanette and saying, she ain't no better than I am, and she's over there learning to do that data. She can do these sort of functions and stuff. I can do that too. So it sort of equalizes the playing field. When I see my neighbors doing data, collecting data and talking about analysis and taking me on a data walk, I can do that too. So just, and I'm going to be very blunt on this. If you're in people of color communities, we're also fighting this thing that's been ingrained into our things, that if you're Black or brown, that ain't consistent with working with numbers, right? So we backed off of a lot of things because the culture and the narrative is Black and brown people ain't good with numbers. So overcoming that and getting people back in the thing that we can deal with numbers. We deal with numbers all the time. So getting people involved in participatory community action research. You can pay them, right? You then have ambassadors who can go out. They are going to look through the lens of community and figuring out, how do we share data? So somebody was raising the question about visualization of the data. How do you move from all these charts to things that are more consumable by people? Well, community participatory research folks are likely to be able to give you insights into that. So the final point I would make is about governance and business rules, right? We have some business rules around who can have access to what type of data and who controls the data and all of that, that are impediments to equity. Because when you look at who's sitting at those seats and controlling this, they don't reflect the kind of sentiment of multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-perspective things that you need to have around the data governance and the rulemaking. And the final point that I would make is, and having been the leader in a data intermediary, I always say this: we don't, and government doesn't own the data. The people own the data. We are custodians in our role. Be you a government bureaucrat, be you a nonprofit intermediary, you do not own the data, and you need to behave consistently with interacting with people who do own the data, which is the people own the data and not bureaucrats, which means that you should be opening ways for the people to interact with that data. That's the function of those who are custodians, to make sure that those data are managed, that they're quality, and that the people have access to what they need to make good decisions.
I don't like going after Junious. But I'll quickly add this question just because you touched on the community piece, Junious. Someone did ask about strategies for sharing data in an easily accessible way for community members. Any thoughts from you? And then Nanette, of course, would love to hear any thoughts you have around that.
Who are we trying to reach, and what's the best way to reach it? I think we have a problem that we try to aggregate everybody into the audience. Boy, if you're doing community level work like we're doing in collective impact, maybe there are 10 different audiences that you need, and you need to step back. And again, how representative of your table is of your community is a real asset here, because people can tell you and to help you figure out the user cases. So you say, hey, we got 5 user cases that we're going to figure out how to do our data. So what is it that people who do not want to see no numbers, right? They might hear a number they want to see. So storytelling, right, might be the way that we're data storytelling. Again, it's thinking expansively about who are we trying to reach and what are the methods that are best suited for reaching them. There are also some powerful visualization tools that are out there that don't cost you anything to say, because we such diverse audience, let's use a visualization package and on the same thing, run 3 different charting formats. That you're not trying to predict what everybody or cram everybody in, but be expansive as possible so that people have a number of ways of connecting and interacting with those data. And but going back to it, what are the methods by which people are going to consume that data? Who needs a guide through the data? Who just needs a data packet and a few tables, and really having all of those things available? And I know it sounds like a lot of work, but that's where the technology comes in. It's not. Once you have the basic analysis and interpretation done, you've got this suite of all these tools. Why not use them, right? They're all communicating the same basic data, and as long as the data are accurate and reliable and you're using methodologies that's appropriate for the type of data, then what's the problem in doing 3 or 5 different displays of that same data, because you're trying to interact and connect with a diverse community?
And one thing I just want to underscore is hopefully before you get to sharing that data, you've taken the time to really understand how the different groups of folks in your community are going to use that data, because it's important that you understand that so that you are capturing the right data to share with them. And the whole goal of sharing data with the community is to inspire action. So you have to be able to ensure that you are sharing it in a way that they can easily use to do whatever they need to do in the community. And it's also one thing I'll always add is it's important to contextualize the data. I think that is really important. Explaining why that data matters, what it represents, and how it relates to the community's goals or concerns. It's really important to do that. And how do you connect that data that you're sharing to action? How do they operationalize that? How do they take that data and use it for whatever strategy or for whatever change that they're trying to do that? And I think one of the things Junious said too is, how do you empower community ownership? I think it's really important. How do you empower the community to take that ownership? And one of the things that I've also come to realize that oftentimes, even when they do have a data person on staff, how do you actually facilitate conversations around data? How do you actually have a conversation about that data with the people in your collaborative or in that collective group? How do you have conversations about it, and being very intentional about that?
Right. And that relates back to having a learning agenda. And that's where Courtney started. If you've got a learning agenda, it begins to frame some of the things that Nanette is talking about. Why are you looking for that data? What questions are you trying to answer? And how do you want to use that? a lot of that can come from your development of a learning plan. So what's coming back into the work group or into the steering committee or whatever is really responsive to something that that group said, in this process, we have these 3 learning agenda items and the data are connecting them back. And that's where you get the power and the synergy. They asked, we collected the data, they got a chance to look at it, they learned something, and then that's when we get to the real work. We say, as a result of that, what are we going to do differently in this strategy or intervention based on what we learned? So that whole, and that's why I keep coming back to routine, right? Whether it's PDCA, I don't care what it is. You just want to routinely plan, act, take some time to assess where it is, figure out where you want to do, where you want to go, and go around the cycle again, right? It's cyclical, but it's spiraling cyclical if you do it right, where every time you're getting better and the data saying we're improving, you're in that spiraling cycle. So it's not like I'm just circling around going nowhere. You're moving upward, and people will feel that over time. And again, if it's a routinized process and people are seeing that, you remember last quarter we were here, and lo and behold is here. What we said we wanted to do seems to be working. What do we do next? And people get excited. That's when people come back to meetings. I want to know, how did what we planned and theorized last time hit the ground, and did it work, right? That's where people get excitement and engagement, and that's where the interventions get even more effective, because people start thinking all the time about how do we get just that additional nudge on this.
And I would just quickly offer, like, thinking about other partnerships you can leverage in your community, right? So universities are a prime place, right, where you have graduate students, folks needing internship opportunities, et cetera, who can support with that data literacy piece, right? Whether that's building out some type of training program for your organization or actually being the one to do those trainings, et cetera. Just thinking about to Junius's point, right? Like thinking more expansively about how you get that support, because it all doesn't have to be in-house, right? So that's one of the things I would offer as well.
Yeah, I would just add to your list, if you're in America, check the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership to see if there's an affiliate in your city. It's an Urban Institute project. These are all data intermediaries in big cities around the country. There are 40 some of them. That's a great place, because if you got one of them, boy, you've got a real asset to move your work. If not, and in addition, universities, tech volunteer groups are another source out there that I can't even remember the names. A couple of those that are recruiting tech people who then do volunteer projects, and often you can find good folks there. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Junious. If we could quickly, this is more of a technical question, but I do, because we talked about visualization tools. They asked, what free or paid visualization tools do you recommend? And they've named things such as Tableau, Clear Impact, Power BI that they're currently paying for and using, but are there others that you would recommend at little to no cost?
No. Do the one that you can afford to manage. My problem, and the reason that we stayed, I'm old school. I'm still using Excel. I can get pretty much any sort of chart or graphic, and I know that I'm not into the new age, but I would just make this point to you. Make sure that whichever one you do, you can afford. People are buying into Clear Impact or some of these systems, right? And they're getting the packages and they don't have what you need. And then all of a sudden, everything you need has a bill with it. You really need to consider internal capacity, a Tableau, Clear Impact, a Power BI. What can your staffing or your data partner sustain, right? And comfortably use. And that's the one that you should go with. I've just seen these groups that have bought into these systems, and boy, then I'm stuck with a big bill. Yeah, make it on the basis of I got a person on staff, or there are a lot of people in the community who can use Tableau, who can use whatever it is, so that you don't get stuck. And where I'm going is the ability to interact with folks in your community who say, well, what about displaying it like this? And to have real time, your techies be able to say, okay, let me run that. That's the interaction you want. And that has to do with what's the staff or internal capacity to use any of those tools and to interact with people, your stakeholders, to produce the things that they want to see in your representations or visualizations.
Yeah, and just to add, I'm, the ones that you mentioned, Courtney, are the ones I'm familiar with. But I think, like Junior said, I think it's really important to consider your staff capacity because, all of these tools, you need some kind of training. And like it doesn't just take whatever you want and just spits out graphs or images for you. You have to manipulate it some way. So do you have somebody on staff to be able to do that? And can you sustain it long term? Excel is still great, and Microsoft has a lot of free trainings that you can take to really do some really innovative stuff with just basic Excel. So I think it's important to do that. But I think really, rather than focus on recommendations or what works for somebody, I think it's important to get to know what your own capacity is and what you can afford. And also, a lot of times, these dashboards sometimes might not necessarily integrate with your existing data systems that you have or the systems that you have in-house. So that's also another critical thing to think about. Is this something that can integrate into my existing systems that I have in-house or not? So I think rather than focus on recommendations for folks, really think through about how you're going to use it and how it's going to impact the work that you're doing.
Thank you both. So we have about 7 minutes left. I'm going to try to get through like 2 or 3 more questions. There's some really great questions in the Q&A box. So thank you all for that. The first is around, it's sort of the antithesis of what we just talked about, right? Do you have suggestions for starting data gathering or sharing when there's not much infrastructure? So for example, solid baby steps for organizations that may already be overwhelmed with the work that they are doing.
Well, I like to start by whatever data capacity I've got in the collaborative, really starting by helping people kind of organize their own data and their use of their own data. We were talking before why people do or don't get engaged in data work. Benefit. So I usually, and my organizations already came that our first thing is no matter what else happens, we're going to leave you with some direct benefit. We're going to help you get your spreadsheets organized and stuff so that we can generate this data, because the early stage of the data stuff, again, isn't this big flowery system. The earliest stage of data integration and collective impact is going around and looking at and doing the best that we can with everybody's Excel spreadsheets or whatever it is that they're using to this, so that we're trying to see comparability in terms of race and gender classifications, code book, all of the that's the first stage. And the first thing is sort of somebody going in, seeing those things, helping you to maximize. We're just simple Excel. We'll help you maximize your use of the Excel stuff. So everybody gets a little more comfortable and stuff. But that's the first stage. And you do that with 20 or 30 different organizations. It's overwhelming to get everybody's thing. So you get the first picture. That's usually the first picture of thing. We got 10 different organizations who are doing this after school thing. They're all doing different data. The first thing is saying, can we get a view of how many kids are we serving and what's the nature of what we're serving and all of the basic. That's usually the early steps and some outcome related stuff. So that would be my counsel to folks.
And I think one of the key tenets of, collective impact is shared measurement. So I definitely would encourage you to really make sure that you've clearly defined what each of those measures are. What are the measures that you want to track as a collective group? And make sure you're defining that very clearly, and defining what the responses are for each of those measures. I think is really, really important, because sometimes people might interpret different metrics differently. So it's important to define it so that they are collecting it the appropriate way. Or if you get it back from different your different organizations and they're defining it differently, you know how to manipulate that data so that it aligns with what you all are hoping to achieve. So definitely start with making sure that you have clear definitions. What are you interested in measuring, and having very, very clear definitions of it. You know, like a lot of times we make assumptions like demographic information. Everybody knows that. No, spell that out very clearly. You know, there's a difference between sex and gender. Make sure you're spelling all of these. What are the responses that you're interested in? Because if you don't define that and every organization is doing something different, you can't aggregate up once you get that data. So it's really important to do that. Also, have very clear ways of how you're going to share the information, and understand that there are laws and things that protect data rights, making sure that you understand that and you're communicating that clearly to everyone in the group, how you're going to share that data, how you're going to store it, the frequency that you're going to be collecting the data, how you're going to use that data. I think all of that is really important, and all of that goes into sort of your data sharing agreement, making sure that everybody is in agreement with what is going to be listed in that particular document.
Thank you both so much. All right, we have 3 minutes, so I think we can squeeze one more in, just like quick responses to this. Someone's asking, they essentially have been tasked to lead, I'm assuming like a CI initiative at this point, and they're saying they have the opportunity to sort of rebuild or reestablish the culture across the different committees, et cetera. So what would you all offer as 1 or 2 things that they could do to reset their table in terms of like a culture around data and learning?
Really quickly, I would go to everybody or all of those groups around the table already around the tables and ask them what's working and not working for you, right? And then groups that haven't been there, I would go out in the community and try to learn what are the effective tools and methods of meeting that they use in the community. So I'm doing my own reconnaissance to bring into the table to then have a conversation with everybody of, here's some practices we learned from community-based groups that they think work. Here's some things from the table. Here's some don't do's. And again, that belonging conversation. We're going to co-construct the reality of how we're going to operate with each other and the culture we want to build.
I love that. And just to add to that, I would say just make sure that there's that feedback loop. There's opportunity to capture feedback as you're going along the journey, and addressing concerns that may come up as you go along it.
Beautiful. Thank you both, Junious and Nanette, so much. I learned a lot too. I was taking notes. I always learn from both of you. So thank you both so much. Thank you to Tracy, who's in the ether, and to Jen, our executive director, who's also on the call today. And I want to thank all of you for your questions and for your resources in the chat. The chat was very lit today. I just wanted to share a couple more things before our time ends. So again, thank you all so much for engaging today. I do want to share that we are in the month of April, which is the Collective Impact Action Summit month. So the summit this year is April 30th through May 2nd, featuring a closing keynote by the Stacey Abrams, and that's going to be live only. So definitely make sure you mark that on your calendars. But we're really excited about this year's summit, and we're really going to be focusing on the power of movement building and collective impact and collaborative work. So we'd love to see you all there. Again, we have tons of resources on our website, so definitely encourage you all to take a look at the resources, toolkits, articles, podcasts, etc., to continue your learning and to continue diving in. Again, the podcast as well. And then you will receive, along with the recording of today's session in the deck, you'll also receive a survey. So please, please, please complete that survey for us. We would love to hear your feedback. But again, thank you all so much. Thank you to Junious, thank you to Nanette, and thank you to my entire team for your support today. And everyone have a great day.